The alarm blared like a jet engine as I jolted upright, my hand smacking against nothing but thin air. I had set it 15 minutes early because today wasn't just any day, it was the day. The day I officially became the human assigned to guard an alien. Not in some high-tech government building, mind you, but here, in my tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and suspiciously sticky floors. I rubbed my eyes and cursed silently. This wasn't going to be just a job, it was going to be a disaster waiting to happen, and somehow, I had front row seats. I'd barely finished pulling on my shirt when a blinding flash lit up the room, making my vision dance with stars. My knees buckled, my coffee mug jumped out of my hand like it had a life of its own, and then she was there. Just there. Not in a doorway, not with a polite announcement, but floating inches above my bed, glowing faintly with an iridescent shimmer that made me question whether I'd finally lost my mind. "Good morning, human," she said, her voice melodic but with a teasing lilt that made my brain short-circuit. She wasn't just an alien, she was flawless, mischievous, and apparently aware that my jaw had hit the floor. "I trust you are ready for today's studies?" Studies?" My voice squeaked. I hadn't even had a chance to pour coffee or eat breakfast, and already I was failing at basic English. "Yes. Studies. Close proximity. Sleep analysis. Human habits. All that delightful nonsense." She floated down lazily, hair, or whatever passed for hair on her planet, shimmering like liquid silver. "And don't worry. I promise to be minimally disruptive." She said this while plopping herself onto my bed like it was a velvet throne rather than the sagging mattress it actually was. "Minimally disruptive?" I echoed, unsure if I should be terrified or flattered. Her grin widened in that alien way, the kind that made you forget your own name. "Well, perhaps slightly more than minimal." She twitched a finger and suddenly, my pillow soared above my head, spinning like a frisbee. I ducked, barely avoiding a collision with the ceiling. "Okay, wait." I lunged for it, arms flailing like a cartoon character. Of course, gravity didn't seem to obey my rules. The pillow zoomed away again, and she giggled, a sound that could melt steel, or at least, apparently, my dignity. "You see," she said, leaning back and floating half above the bed. "Human reactions are fascinating. So predictable." Then she flicked her fingers, and the sheets themselves curled around me like snakes. I tumbled, arms flailing, barely keeping from smacking my face into the nightstand. Every instinct in me screamed to get up, to assert authority, but something about her made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way she deliberately hovered just out of reach, the way her eyes glowed softly, or the subtle curve of amusement in her posture. I couldn't even say no. All right, I gasped, trying to sound confident. Maybe we should start with introductions. Or protocols." My voice cracked somewhere around the word. "Protocols. Oh, introductions are boring," she said with a dramatic sigh, waving her hand. Suddenly, a set of tiny, floating orbs appeared, circling around me like mischievous satellites. They zoomed between my arms and legs, making me dance a ridiculous jig just to avoid being poked. "Let's skip to the fun part, human reactions under duress." I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in the process. She floated closer, eyes twinkling, and tapped me on the shoulder. The moment she did, my vision swirled into a weird, dreamlike state. I felt my body lift slightly off the ground, hovering, then land face first, into my own bed. I groaned, tangled in sheets, while she landed lightly beside me, perfectly at ease, like this was all completely normal. "You are unusually gullible," she murmured, circling me like a playful predator. "I like that." I blinked at her, trying to process her words, trying to figure out if I was being complimented or insulted, or both. Before I could answer, her finger twitched again, and suddenly my blanket slithered away, leaving me exposed in the middle of the bed. My brain short-circuited, and I opened my mouth to yell, but she giggled, a soft trill that seemed to vibrate through the room. "Relax. I won't yet," she said. Her grin widened mischievously. Then, with a tilt of her head, she suddenly teleported my coffee cup into my hand. I blinked, startled. The cup hadn't even touched the counter before it was in my palm, steaming and perfect, as if mocking me for failing at basic human coordination. I couldn't even argue. Not because I agreed, but because her sheer presence was magnetic, overwhelming, and undeniably entertaining. And admittedly, just a little thrilling. Somewhere deep in the back of my mind, I realized that today, the line between work and chaos had already vanished. She had claimed the bed, the room, and possibly my sanity, and somehow, I didn't have the nerve to stop her. She stretched dramatically, bouncing lightly on the mattress, her gaze teasing me like a cat watching a mouse that insists on being cute while panicking. "Human," she whispered, floating inches from my face. "You really are going to be so much fun to study." And with a flash of light, she twirled away, sending a cascade of sparkling motes across the ceiling, leaving me panting, flustered, and already suspicious that I'd never sleep alone again. By the time I scrambled to reclaim some sense of control, reassembling pillows, trying to scoop floating sheets off my head, and muttering about needing hazard pay, I realized something terrifying. I was already hooked. And the worst part? I couldn't say no. Not to the pranks, not to the chaos, and certainly not to the alien herself. The day was only beginning, and somehow, I already knew I was in for a very long, very ridiculous ride. By mid-morning, I had learned a hard truth. Sleep was no longer mine, and neither, apparently, was personal space. The alien had declared my bed her research station, a term she waved around like it made her right to commandeer my entire apartment sound perfectly reasonable. Every attempt to reclaim a corner of blankets or a scrap of pillow space had ended in disaster, each failure funnier and more humiliating than the last. Breakfast was an ordeal. I had poured cereal into a bowl, only to glance away for a second, and it had levitated, circled the room like a UFO, and then landed perfectly atop her head. She had giggled, a tinkling sound that made me question every rule I'd ever lived by. "Humans eat so predictably," she said, tilting her head. "I just had to see if you could catch it." The bowl, somehow, had not spilled, just perched on her hair like a metallic hat. I sighed, realizing arguing was pointless. She spent the next hour bouncing lightly on the bed, floating toys and utensils around the room, and occasionally tapping me with one finger, making my vision flicker into bizarre dreamlike flashes. In one blink, I was a chicken doing the cha-cha in a crowded street. In another, I was serenading a very confused mailman while wearing a tutu. I blinked and shook my head, only to find myself sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring at her with wide, helpless eyes. "You're very sensitive," she said, hovering above me with a smug grin. "I think this is my favorite part of the experiment." Her tone implied amusement and mischief in equal measure, and I realized that the word, experiment, had long since stopped sounding clinical. Trying to regain control, I attempted to leave the room. One foot out the door, and suddenly, the floor beneath me shifted, wobbling like a trampoline. I bounced awkwardly, arms flailing, while she hovered, clapping and giggling. "You really are gullible," she said, zooming closer. "I could do this all day." Lunch was no less chaotic. She had somehow conjured floating plates of spaghetti that twirled around her like animated snakes. Each time I tried to reach for a fork, the food leapt out of reach, weaving intricate patterns in the air. I ended up dodging noodles like a contestant in an obstacle course, while she laughed at my increasingly frantic expressions. The noodles occasionally splashed onto my face, leaving me sticky and humiliated. Somehow, I didn't mind as much as I probably should have. Between the pranks, small moments of intimacy began sneaking through. She had a habit of mimicking human gestures in slightly exaggerated ways, stretching lazily across the bed, brushing a hand along the blanket where my arm had just been, leaning close to examine the peculiar human habit of yawning. Each time, my heart skipped, and I caught myself staring a second too long before fumbling with excuses about needing to fetch a towel, a pillow, or sanity itself. She always returned with a grin that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing, and yes, she enjoyed it. By afternoon, my friends started noticing my increasingly erratic behavior. One called me during a supposed lunch break, only to hear me scream as a floating pen zoomed past my ear, narrowly missing my face. I tried to cover it by claiming it was a ceiling fan issue or, more plausibly, a minor home renovation accident. Another friend poked fun at my distracted tone in a group chat, asking if I was finally losing it or if a romantic entanglement was distracting me. I quickly typed a furious denial, even as I glanced toward the bed and caught her floating there with a teasing smile. "Do they often get this easily distracted?" she asked innocently, eyes glinting. I tried to scowl, but the scowl faltered under the sheer absurdity of her expression. "Not usually," I admitted, muttering under my breath. She leaned closer, brushing her hand against my arm in what she called a scientific gesture. The warmth sent a ripple through me, distracting me enough for her next prank to hit. Suddenly, the room tilted, furniture spinning gently, like I was trapped inside a snow globe. I flailed, clutching the nearest object, a lamp, which promptly bounced out of my hand and landed, half-draped, on the bed again. She floated above me, arms crossed, smirking. "You do make these reactions very entertaining," she said. Even mundane tasks became traps. "Fetching a drink from the kitchen?" The cup followed me back, bouncing slightly off the floor and sending a tiny shower of water over my head. "Walking to the bathroom?" Towels twirled in midair, wrapping me like a mummy. She laughed softly at my futile attempts to act normal. Each prank was designed to frustrate, embarrass, and somehow charm me all at once. By evening, I realized something remarkable. Despite being absolutely exhausted and completely covered in noodle sauce, spilled water, and floating paper clips, I was actually enjoying myself. She had a way of turning chaos into fun, mischief into flirtation. Every prank, every unexpected touch, every teasing grin built a tension that I couldn't, and didn't want to, resist. I was helpless, flustered, and entirely captivated. When she finally settled next to me, dangling her legs off the side of the bed, I exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of relief and dread. I knew this was only the beginning. There would be more pranks, more chaos, more moments of flustered embarrassment and awkward intimacy. And deep down, a small, stubborn part of me realized I wouldn't want it any other way. I couldn't say no, and somehow, I didn't want to. Things only got worse, or better depending on how desperate your life was for chaos, once she realized I was starting to respond to her tricks. It was like lighting a match in a fireworks factory. She became bolder, more creative, and definitely more intimate in her pranks. The morning began with what I can only describe as a full-scale bedroom obstacle course. I had barely sat up when a floating chair zoomed past my face, narrowly missing my ears, while her glowing eyes sparkled with amusement. She had animated my furniture, causing my drawers to twitch, the lamp to do pirouettes, and my alarm clock to spin like it was auditioning for Cirque du Soleil. I flailed, trying to grab anything to stabilize myself, only to be met with a floating pillow that smacked me square in the chest, leaving me gasping. She hovered above, hands behind her back, watching with a grin that could make mortals melt. "You're predictable, but entertaining," she said. Every prank carried the faintest touch of flirtation. A hairbrush floated toward me and, just as I reached to catch it, tapped my shoulder lightly. I yelped, almost tripping over my own feet, and she giggled like 1,000 wind chimes. "Human reactions are quite delightful," she murmured, leaning close enough that I could feel her warmth, even without faces to interpret expressions. My face burned, and I swore I heard my own heartbeat pounding like a drumline. Determined not to be outwitted, I attempted a counterattack. I grabbed a blanket and tried to toss it over her, thinking I had finally gained some control. Instead, it looped around my arm, flung me backward, and left me sprawled on the floor while she floated elegantly above, clapping once in mock celebration. "Nice try, human," she said sweetly, her grin absolutely devastating. "I admire effort." By afternoon, things had escalated beyond pranks and into full-blown prank wars. She had animated the cutlery to follow me around the apartment like tiny, metallic guard dogs. Every time I bent down to pick one up, it zipped away, circling my head in a dizzying spiral. At one point, I tripped over the laundry basket and ended up sliding across the floor, landing awkwardly against the doorframe. She floated closer, brushing her hand across my arm as if apologizing, but with a mischievous sparkle in her glowing eyes that made it clear she enjoyed my clumsiness. My friends had started noticing even more. Calls went unanswered, texts were delayed or strange, and one friend nearly screamed when I accidentally sent a floating pencil barreling across the street during a video call. I tried explaining it as a magnetic anomaly in the building, but they were skeptical. I couldn't exactly admit that my apartment had been turned into a playground for an alien trickster who liked me a little too much. Romantic tension, meanwhile, was climbing to ridiculous heights. Every prank seemed designed to get us closer physically, while simultaneously embarrassing me in ways that made my head spin. She had started the day by floating beside me in bed, lightly brushing my arm while animated silverware hovered above our heads, circling like tiny moons. "Do humans always get flustered this easily?" she asked, eyes glinting. I coughed, turning red and fumbling for an excuse about needing water. She tilted her head and giggled, a sound that made me feel every nerve in my body tingle. By evening, things had reached a peak of absurdity. She had teleported me into increasingly ridiculous locations inside my own apartment. One moment, I was attempting to fold laundry, the next, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the kitchen counter, staring at a blender that insisted on dancing to some unearthly rhythm. I jumped down, only to be tripped by a rogue broom that had decided it was sentient. She floated above, utterly pleased, her laughter filling the room like an alien symphony. There was, of course, an upside to all this chaos. Beneath the pranks and the floating furniture, a strange intimacy had formed. Every brush of her hand, every teasing nudge, every wink, or glowing sparkle in lieu of a wink, sent shivers down my spine. I realized that despite being completely helpless, utterly flustered, and possibly mildly insane, I didn't want her to stop. My brain screamed about professionalism, duty, and common sense, but my heart was utterly lost. At one point, she hovered so close I could feel her presence press against me, the faint hum of her alien energy vibrating through the mattress. "You're fascinating," she whispered. "I think I might enjoy this experiment too much." Her words were soft, teasing, but there was warmth behind them, a strange, thrilling affection hidden beneath the chaos. I stammered, unsure whether to argue, protest, or confess that I already liked her more than I should. She didn't give me the chance. Instead, she flicked her fingers, and suddenly, the room tilted, furniture spinning gently as if reality itself had decided to join her game. I clutched a chair for support and slid helplessly to the floor, groaning as she floated down beside me, radiant and entirely unbothered. "You really are hopeless," she said with a teasing pout. "But hopeless in such an adorable way." I froze, realizing that every prank, every mischief-laden glance, every chaotic moment had been building to this point, an intimate, ridiculous, utterly irresistible connection. By the time I finally collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and sticky from noodles, spilled water, and rogue floating objects, she leaned closer and brushed her hand lightly against mine. "Tomorrow we begin the advanced studies," she murmured, her grin both promising and terrifying. "You might want to prepare yourself." I gulped, secretly thrilled, knowing full well that I would never be prepared for whatever she had planned, but I wouldn't say no. Not now, not ever. And somehow, between the chaos, the pranks, and the constant, flustered panic, I realized I was already falling for her. The alien trickster had invaded my life, my apartment, and my bed, and there was no turning back. By the time night fell, I had long since accepted the fact that my apartment, and my life, were no longer my own. The alien had officially claimed my bed, my routines, and possibly my sanity, and yet, strangely, I didn't mind. She hovered above me, arms crossed, the faint glow of her aura casting playful shadows across the walls. Her smirk was teasing, triumphant, and undeniably charming. Somehow, despite all the chaos, the disasters, and the relentless pranks, I found myself smiling. I wanted this. She floated closer, brushing a hand against my shoulder as if to test a theory, though I wasn't sure whether the theory was about human reactions or my willingness to surrender. So, she said, her voice a melodic whisper, I think we can conclude that your species is both utterly fascinating and completely adorable. Her glowing eyes caught mine, and for a moment, time felt absurdly slow. I think you enjoy causing chaos, I admitted, rubbing the back of my neck. The words came out sheepishly, but she only laughed, a sound like tinkling glass that somehow managed to feel both mischievous and warm. I do, she said bluntly. But only because you make it fun. You actually react in interesting ways. Most humans are boring. Her words made me blush, though she probably couldn't notice the exact hue in my face through her alien vision. I opened my mouth to argue, to protest, to claim that I was not, in fact, fun or interesting in any way, but she waved her hand and flicked a small object toward me. Instantly, the room tilted slightly, sending my coffee cup spinning in a lazy arc above my head before landing safely on the floor. I yelped, swiping at it instinctively, and she laughed again. You see? She said, floating closer, her hand brushing against mine ever so lightly. I like that you care. That you try. Her smile softened, though still with that teasing spark that made my heart pound. I realized, suddenly, that all the chaos, the pranks, the floating furniture, the dream manipulations, had led to this, a strange, absurd intimacy that I couldn't resist. The final prank of the evening came without warning. She twirled in the air, a trail of glittering lights following her every movement, and suddenly my bed was lifted slightly, hovering as if we were in zero gravity. I squealed, gripping the mattress, only for her to gently tap me and make me float a few inches higher. Consider this, advanced study, she murmured, her grin impossibly wide. Gravity reactions under stress. I flailed, legs kicking, arms waving, but somehow managed to stay upright. And in that moment, something shifted. I laughed, not with panic, not with fear, but with sheer, ridiculous joy. She laughed too, the sound filling the room in a way that felt almost intimate, almost like a promise. Eventually, gravity returned to normal, my bed settling back onto the floor with a soft thud. I lay there, breathless, messy hair sticking up in all directions, clothes slightly askew, and I realized that I had stopped resisting. The alien hovered beside me, a soft glow illuminating her features, and I felt a rush of warmth that wasn't entirely from embarrassment. You're incredible, I said softly, honestly. I had no idea if she could fully grasp the depth of human emotion, but the words felt right. I know, she said with a wink, or at least a glowing glimmer where a wink might have been. And you, human, are entertainingly hopeless. I think I'll keep you around for research purposes. She tapped my hand gently with her finger, and it felt intimate, playful, and impossibly romantic all at once. We collapsed together onto the bed, side by side, though not without her floating a few inches above me first, just to be dramatic. She fiddled with the blanket in a way that sent it wrapping around my shoulders like a soft cocoon, then leaned closer, humming softly. You can stop pretending you're in charge, she whispered. Here you don't get to say no. That's the rule. And somehow, I didn't want to. Every prank, every ridiculous disaster, every flustered moment of embarrassment had built this strange, chaotic bond between us. I laughed softly, brushing her hand in response, feeling the warmth of her energy in a way that was utterly new to me. She floated closer again, resting her head lightly against the edge of my shoulder. It was intimate, awkward, and entirely perfect. Tomorrow, she murmured, her glowing eyes sparkling, we continue the studies. There will be more pranks. More chaos. More. She paused dramatically, glancing at me with undeniable intent. Fun. I groaned, half in exasperation, half in anticipation, knowing full well that I would never get a normal day again. And yet, somehow, that thought didn't bother me. Because despite all the chaos, the pranks, and the absurdity, I had discovered something extraordinary, that an alien trickster could steal not only your bed but your heart, and somehow make it feel like the most natural, ridiculous, and thrilling thing in the universe. She floated higher for a moment, then twirled in the air, leaving a scattering of glittering lights that drifted lazily to the floor. "Sleep well, human," she whispered, voice soft but teasing. "Or try to. I'll be nearby studying, of course." I chuckled, sinking into the messy sheets, letting exhaustion overtake me, letting chaos settle around us like a soft blanket. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't scared. I wasn't resisting. I was exactly where I wanted to be, in the bed, in the chaos, and completely under the influence of a very clever, very mischievous, utterly irresistible alien. Tomorrow, the pranks would resume. Gravity might fail, furniture might dance, and I would probably end up flustered, embarrassed, and flailing more than once. But for now, in the soft glow of her presence and the warm, ridiculous intimacy of our shared chaos, I could finally admit the truth. I couldn't say no. And I didn't want to.